Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Tenpenny Files. I'm your host, Dr. Sherri Tenpenny, where every day we have conversations that are vital and often controversial on topics that will challenge what you've been told and then reveal what has been hidden. These compelling conversations will make you think, spark debate, and hopefully inspire action. Join me here every day at 3 p.m. Eastern Time to hear the authors and documentary filmmakers who have something important to say but have often been silenced or censored. Today's conversation is with our special guest, clinical psychologist Dr. Chloe Carmichael, and her book, which is Can I Say That? Why Free Speech Matters and How to Use It Fearlessly, a book about mental health benefits of free speech. Dr. Chloe, welcome so much to the Tenpenny Files. It's just such a pleasure to have you here with us today.
Thanks, Dr. T. The pleasure is mine.
Well, let's get started with the title of your book. Why does free speech matter?
Well, I'm sure it matters for a million reasons, even more than I could explain. But as a clinical psychologist, I explain in the book some of the psychology benefits, why free speech is good for our mental health. So there's really three main areas that speech helps us with as human beings from a mental health perspective. Those are cognitive, emotional, and social. So on the cognitive side, speech is one of our most primary tools for sorting through information. It forces us to become rational. So, for example, when we think about if-then statements or testing a hypothesis or rapidly exchanging information, all of that hinges on language and written language or spoken language. And then from an emotional side, when we talk, we emotionally regulate. We've all heard the expression, oh, get that off my chest, or you have a heart to heart. But the science is there too, as I'm sure you know. When we have a good heart to heart, our cortisol levels will drop. When we name our emotions, the amygdala in the brain starts to settle down and deactivate. The amygdala is the part of the brain that gets active during fear. And then that third part, the social bonding, which is so important for our mental health. As a clinical psychologist, it's a required part of any assessment. Social buffering, being tapped into our support network. And when we're not being authentic or real with each other, or they're not being real with us, our social support is, of course, degraded. That can lead to all kinds of issues of depression and anxiety with isolation and fear. So those are three quick overview right there is cognitive, emotional, and social, why free speech is good for mental health.
Wow, that's really, really important. I guess we never really think about how it impacts mental health. And you say words are not violence, but in today's climate, many people feel deeply harmed by certain speech. There, all this hate speech stuff, and people get so offended, and they have safe spaces and at universities and things like that. As a psychologist, do you frequently encounter those kind of complaints in your practice that people feel harmed by speech? And how do you
Yeah.
that from emotional discomfort and psychological harm?
Yeah, Dr. T, there's so many questions packed in there. Thank you. That's a great question. So, as you said, words are not violence. That's actually, I think, part of the introductory chapter of the book is that words are not violence. And yet that's a phrase that just gets thrown around so much these days, ironically, by people who think that they're being so compassionate because they're like, well, look how compassionate I am. I even recognize the power of my words, and words are violence. And so therefore I'm so compassionate because I'm the speech police, right? And I believe that, or I like to think that they mean well, but actually, you know, we don't have safe spaces when people are stifling themselves. True safe spaces are spaces where people can withstand disagreement and they can work things out. Also, true safe spaces, if you think about it, hinge on some level on trust. And how can we have social trust when we know that people are just probably masking a lot of their true beliefs? So I think there's so many misnomers there when it comes, to these phrases. And again, that phrase, words are violence, as a psychologist, a clinical psychologist, it makes me think of psychoticism. So in mental health, we have kind of a spectrum. So, if you're seeing little green men, you're broken from reality. We call that psychotic. If you're, a garden variety New Yorker, Woody Allen style, sees their therapist every week, you're neurotic. Um, but when we say things like words are violence and people start taking that literally, that is psychotic, right? Like that's the kind of thing I could see somebody on an inpatient unit for mental health coming in and saying, I had to stab him. He said the certain words, and so and then we do see this. We do see it's interestingly enough, it's statistically the same people, and I can get into those details if we have time. But statistically, it's the same people that want to limit speech out of, what they believe is their, higher compassion that ironically are the same people that are more predisposed by their own self-report to endorse political violence. Again, that's because speech is actually one of our primary tools for regulating and for managing conflicts.
How did this whole concept of hate speech come about? And that and you mentioned, like I had to stab him because he said such a thing, this whole thing about trigger words that people get so easily triggered and and they're so offended. People get offended by everything and so people then don't talk at all. So let's start with how did hate speech come about? And where did this concept of being so offended and being triggered by words, how did that come into play?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I did some Google searches on this actually, and the statistics are in the book. But the phrase hate speech really starts to skyrocket in use, around probably 2016 or so. And I think that that's because it began to be weaponized as part of a political agenda where people started to realize, okay, if we don't want people to discuss that they don't really believe a man can become a woman, or if we don't want people to, speak clearly and plainly about race and crime, and even if it's just from a neutral perspective of trying to figure out what the factors are and how to solve the problems, or talk honestly about immigration issues. If we don't want people to talk about that, we can't just tell them, shut up, don't talk about that. But if we wrap it in this, cloak of, oh, well, that's hate speech. And so therefore we're just being super nice. I think that's where it came from. And interestingly, as a clinical psychologist, I can share with you that we all have these trait personality measures, and we all have a certain need for power. Some people have a low, some people have a high need for power. And one of the ways that women most often will express a very intense need for power actually is through excessive nurturing. It's like that forceful, have another bite of soup, dear, and it's like they're being nurturing, but they're really controlling you, right? They're micromanaging you. And I can't help but wonder on some level, we've had this extreme feminization of, universities and corporate America. It's all the HR ladies and all this stuff. And again, I believe they're coming from a good place that they think that this is going to be helpful to people to control their speech. But what they don't understand is that when people can't talk directly about their issues, then they do what we call suppression and repression. They go into denial. They start acting out. They become passive aggressive. They become isolative or hostile, to people instead of just talking about their differences frankly and candidly. So yeah, I do. I think that there's something, as you said, about these trigger words. It's kind of I think a masked way of being able to control speech for the sake of shutting down arguments and discussion, but doing it in this way that's masked as if it's a nurturing behavior.
That's very interesting. And that gives rise to the whole concept of cancel culture. And how is that showing up in your practice?
Sure. Well, interestingly, I share a statistic in the book, I think it's even on the back jacket, that 84% of Americans are fearful of cancel culture, that they hold back on some level because of a fear of cancel culture. And that statistic, I laugh when I say it because That's from 2022 from a New York Times Siena college poll. So if the New York Times in 2022 was acknowledging this, you can only imagine what it's really like today. And I think people are so afraid of saying the wrong thing. It's creating a lot of anxiety, right? I mean, it's a lot of mental energy for many people to almost feel like they're in the witness protection program. And hey, I've been there myself. I just want to say I went through my own set of experiences as a clinical psychologist that led me to really reflect on all of this. And when I was in graduate school and when I was living in New York City, on ABC, Nightline VH1, lots of big shows, I did a lot of what we call self-censoring. And I didn't really see the harm in it. So I think a lot of people do it because they say, well, what's the harm? I'm just holding back. I'm just being nice. And there is a certain amount of healthy self-restraint. And I talk about that in the book too. It can be healthy. We don't have to say literally everything we think. But there is a line where we're not being honest with others about our actual values. And then it can actually start to interfere with our own awareness of our own values. So, Dr. T, I know you just asked about cancel culture, but there's a lot that's attached to that.
Well, it seems to be really prevalent with all the online TikTok and Instagram and all the influencers. I heard an interview. This was, I don't know, not that long ago, within the last couple of months, that young people today, that the number one aspiration of what they want to be when they grow up is to be an internet influencer. And that just blew me away when I heard that. It's not being a doctor or a lawyer or a CPA or even a fireman or a policeman or even a hairdresser. It's about being an internet influencer. And I think that goes along with their feeling of self-worth. And and if they're not one of those influencers, they get canceled. And
Yeah.
what
It also goes into the issue of conformity. Sorry to interrupt you, Dr. T. I just wanted to get you said something I thought was really important there when you raised the issue of social media. It takes me back to your earlier question about where did all this, emphasis on hate speech come from and things like that. And with social media, we actually saw hate speech become encoded in a lot of their, policies. And now we've learned that those policies and what was deemed as, quote, hate speech was actually, and this is by the report of Meta executives, of X, Twitter executives, as well as now YouTube executives, have all acknowledged that the Biden administration was secretly pressuring them to categorize, say vaccine talk, Dr. T, which I know that you've had a lot to say about, trans issues, et cetera. And so the government was actually making it very clear what could and could not be said online if you didn't want to get deplatformed. And to your point, Dr. T, young people wanting to be internet influencers. Therefore, the government was finding a way to really control the narrative. Because if you in 2021, 22 were a young person and you wanted to get views and build a big platform, well, you knew you couldn't go on and talk about, trans issues or vaccine issues or, start asking real talk about BLM and where's all that money going and what really happened with Derek Chauvin, right? And so therefore they absolutely preyed upon what you pointed out there of this extreme desire of young people to be online. They said, okay, well then we'll tell you what you can and cannot say. And that created what we call a false sense of social consensus. So then just your average person going online thinks, well, gee, I must be the only person who really thinks a man can't become a woman, or am I really the only person who has concerns about masking my child? Because you don't know, because the government was doing it secretly of de-throttling and deplatforming people. So when we have a false sense of social consensus, it really does manipulate and distort our sense of reality and of our social community.
Absolutely. I was one of the disinformation dozen, and I was the only person who was personally named by Biden, by then President Biden. I guess because my last name's Tenpenny, it's probably easy enough to remember. But, the whole censorship and everything, all the platforms that got shut down. I mean, I'm still permanently banned from Facebook and Instagram, having my own Instagram account.
Wow.
Permanently banned from, PayPal and Podbean and a couple of other places. So the censorship stuff is real, and it's still really happening. You say in your book, "Can I say that?" I just love that title. I think it's just so good that there are
Thank you.
arguments, that well, wait a second. You talked about the gifts of language. You talked about cognitive and emotional gifts of language. Can you sort of summarize, why those fall into two different categories and how do you define them?
Sure. So that's a great question, really insightful. So, on a certain level, there obviously is overlap with our cognition and our emotion. At the same time, the psychologists do tend to look at them somewhat separately. Like we'll have, chapters on emotion in a textbook, and then we'll have chapters on cognition, even though, there's certainly a great deal of overlap there. Um, but our cognitions can also feed our emotions. So, and we actually have specific regions of our brain that are uniquely for the production and the comprehension of language. It's one of our very unique gifts as humans. And so that's why, as I, mentioned earlier, there's all these incredible gifts of language from the cognitive side. It helps us to sort through information, to exchange information, to test theories. That's why there's also a chapter in my book called, Common Objections to Free Speech. And one of the common objections is, well, what about misinformation? Um, and I explain, well, hey, look, it's actually through speech that our cognitive process thrives. It's one of our primary tools of being able to test ideas and exchange, information and put things into a rational mindset and to have a healthy detachment from our beliefs. So we've all had the experience of saying something aloud and then, gee, as I say this aloud, maybe I realize it doesn't quite make any sense or whatever. Or we do what's called cognitive elaboration, where we'll talk about something and then it will help us to develop the idea. So language helps us to take something which is a totally abstract, intangible object like our thoughts and put it into something, that's concrete and, to build on it and to organize it. But again, with this whole issue of, quote, misinformation, I point out in the book that since the beginning of time, experts have been wrong. So even just because, the experts of the day, there was a doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis in the 1800s. He died, and I see you nodding your head, he died in a mental institution because he believed that physicians should wash their hands. He thought maybe that would really help, hospitals to have better rates of survival. And we all know, say the COVID shot, you get that and can't spread the virus, or, we've had all kinds of situations. And it would be unfair to experts to expect experts to never be wrong, right? That would be ridiculous. And so, one of the cognitive gifts of language is that we can discuss and debate information, even if the experts, disagree with us, because we know Galileo was jailed for the rest of his life for saying that the Earth orbits the sun, right? And I don't blame experts for being wrong, but I will blame them if they try to stop people from discussing and debating what they're saying.
Yeah, and it's a matter of just own it. Okay, well, based on the information I had at hand, this is the premise that I thought was correct. There's been new information, and now I realize that that premise was incorrect based on the new information that I've had. And it seems as though we can't just own things like that anymore. It's like our whole society has become very immature. It's almost like when you were 5 years old, it's like, the glass in the living room was broken. It's like, well, he did it. You point to your brother, right? Instead of just saying, yeah, I'm sorry. We were playing and I broke the glass. The lack of the sense of responsibility, of ownership on disinformation, which is intentionally to tell the wrong thing, as opposed to misinformation that you just got the wrong set of facts, and now based on a different set of facts, you can clearly make a different choice. What do you think about, as a psychologist, about this? Seems to me a very immature attitude about not just accepting responsibility for a premise that you thought was correct and turned out to be not correct.
Yeah, I think that's probably tied. We were speaking just a little bit before we got on the air together about some of these issues at universities, where frankly, some of the speech police problems are the worst. And that's where a lot of these, quote, experts do their dirty work. And we all know the saying, publish or perish, right? And so I think many of them have this terrible fear that if, maybe they made their name, whatever, their ego is wrapped up in all this stuff, they publish on something. I've had it myself. When I was in graduate school, I had experiences of, sort of seeing how the sausage gets made, so to speak, where I saw some data in a lab and I was working in a lab actually that had some stuff to do with critical race theory and things like that. And I raised some questions about this data. And they just said, that's really not the effect we're going for. Um, so, and then there's a Dutch researcher that had published in 2017, and to her credit, she had published, saying that the ADHD brain is totally different than the non-ADHD brain. And, she admitted over email to a New York Times journalist that published recently that, in fact, she realized upon reflection that her data could be interpreted in a completely different way to suggest that there's really no significant differences in the ADHD brain. So hats off to her. But to answer your question, I think that people, these experts and professors, they're afraid of the professional implications. I mean, even with Alzheimer research, we've seen there was some completely fraudulent, totally fabricated data, that slowed down the Alzheimer research progress for years. So I think we have a real problem when we make experts and professors infallible, ethically or intellectually. Again, none of us is infallible. We've all been wrong. We've all made mistakes. So I don't blame them for that. But I think to your point, we probably should try to make a gentler landing for people that want to come forward and say, I was wrong. But again, that's one of the beautiful things of language is through being able to talk and debate about ideas, it does give us a healthy separation from the ideas. So we realize the idea isn't me. It's just an idea that I have, and I can talk about it and then let it go.
Yeah, I think that that's really true. It's sort of like what was going through my mind when you were talking about that was the trust the science, right? What we heard, nonstop at the beginning of COVID, and we still hear it, trust the science. And then we've really found out that almost all the science that they were shoving down our throat was wrong, all of it. The COVID shots didn't, it didn't stop transmission, masks didn't work. The idea of social distancing was just absolute nonsense made up from a high school girl's science class. I mean, and then we found out all the damage done by all the COVID shots, so trust the science and the scientists is just not not good at all. It's like,
No, that phrase, the science is settled, I mean, that should be alarming, right? I mean, science is never settled. The whole point is that you should be able to test and retest. And especially in the social sciences, which is, kind of embarrassingly these days, my domain, we have an incredible replicability crisis, right? So people go around quoting these studies as if they're gospel when I think it's like at least half of the studies that you read in journals, other teams of researchers will try to do them and then they cannot get the same results. It's a replicability crisis. So anyone saying trust the science, I'm like, no thanks. I trust the Bible, trust my husband, but I mean, trust the science. Like, what does that even mean, right?
and then Paul Offit had said years ago, the science about questioning vaccines and the problems with vaccines. The science is done. We've won. You've lost. There's nothing more to talk about. It's like, seriously. So yeah, you're right. It's like this, there's problems with reproducibility in all areas of science, even astronomy. I've spoken to a couple of physicists and I said, really talking to a real scientist who's talking about astronomy and the galaxies and the Big Bang theory and all these things that have been proven to just not be right. And so, in all elements of science, there is the ability to question and keep questioning.
Yeah, I think maybe next time someone tells me that, I'm going to say, I trust the scientific process, which includes constant questioning, constant retesting, constant checking and confirming, and seeing, maybe what was true in this situation may not be true in another situation. And, the scientific process hinges upon inquiry.
That's a great answer. That's a really great answer, and that's a really good place to take a quick break. So we'll hold that thought because that needs to sink in a little bit. We trust the scientific process. That's really very good. So we're going
Thanks.
to take a short break to hear from our sponsors at AmericaOutloud.news. America Out Loud Radio plays the 10 Penny Files on the iHeartRadio network daily at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, Monday through Friday. The next day, after after it's aired live on iHeartRadio, the Tenpenny Files can be heard on Spotify, Pandora, Apple, TuneIn, iHeart Virtual Studio, and on my platform, dr10penny.com and dr10penny.substack.com, where you can also listen anywhere from the world from AmericaOutloud.news. Their media player plays from any computer anywhere in the world. And if you've missed any of the past episodes that we've had, these great conversations, you can find them on one of those podcast platforms. Because there's so many great books and documentaries and so little time to read and to watch, this show is meant to maximize your time and jumpstart your interests. We have a great message from our sponsors, which keeps us going here on the Tenpenny Files and also on AmericaOutloud.news. So sit tight. There's more to come. We will be right back. Zeolite is a detox spray. We work specifically with a company called Touchstone Essentials. They are an incredible company. We've been working with them now for several years. And zeolite is a mineral that goes through your body like a one-way basket. It will clean out heavy metals such as arsenic and mercury, aluminum, cadmium, and it hooks onto those metals from a one-way perspective. So once it's bound, it goes out through your urine or your stools and doesn't get redeposited in other places. Everybody needs to have a detox product in their life, and this one is so easy to use and it's so safe. You can take it when you're pregnant, you can take it when you're nursing, you can give it to little children, you can even give it to infants, and quite frankly, I give it to my dog. I actually put a little bit of the zeolite in his water because until we all stop living in a toxic world, we all need to get some of those extra toxicities out. The heavy metals, the persistent organic pollutants, the things that are floating through the air, the different things that we come in touch with in our environment. And we are a big fan of zeolite from Touchstone Essentials. We've been a big fan of their products for several years. Go to dr10penny.com/detox to get your first bottle of zeolite spray for $50 off.
Well, only when the government bows to the people will America become great again. This is Malcolm Out Loud here. Join me in pushing back against censorship, my fellow Americans. Right at the top of AmericaOutloud.news are the words: many voices, one freedom, united in the First Amendment. Now is our time, my fellow Americans. AmericaOutloud.news, liberty and justice for all.
Well, welcome back, everybody. Today, we're having a great conversation with Dr. Chloe Carmichael about her new book, Can I Say That? Why Free Speech Matters and How to Use It Fearlessly, a book about the mental health benefits of speech. And in case you missed the first part of today's show, let me just tell you a little bit more about Dr. Chloe Carmichael. She's a clinical psychologist who offers practical tools based on communication to help people speak courageously without fear of being canceled. She teaches methods to reconnect the family, friends, and neighbors who've become distant due to political or socially charged disagreements. Dr. Chloe is a USA Today best-selling author and a fellow at the Independent Women's Forum. Dr. Chloe, we're seeing more and more young adults cut off from their friends and family over political views. That young people are growing up within a psychological environment like no other that we've seen. They have speech codes, ideology, peer-based, peer pressure groups, social media policing, fear-driven identity politics, and I think you call that thought threat environment. So talk to us about what that means and what we can do to help our young people through this environment that they're growing up in now.
Wow, thanks, Dr. T. That's such a good question. And unfortunately, you are sadly correct, that we are seeing that. And I've seen it as in my professional life as well as in my personal life of people that are cutting off their parents, their grandparents, over because the most frequent reason is they voted for Trump or they don't believe that a man can become a woman, right? Now, I think that reasonable minds can disagree on who to vote for president. I personally, as much as we just said we never want to say the science is settled, I do think the science is settled on male and female as categories, right? But even if somebody disagrees about that, there's no reason, to cut off friends and family about that. In fact, it's really bad for your mental health. Ironically, though, and I share this in the book about a story of a client, and of course the stories are anonymized. They're not, I'm not sharing anyone's name and personal details, but ironically, it's the people that want to, quote, live a hate-free life that feel that they need to cut off, which is actually, I think, rather hateful, people that have otherwise been very nice to them. And it does run left to right more than it runs right to left in terms of who's cutting off whom and why. And I share this in the book. I call it the 5Ds. So people who identify as liberal are statistically more likely to disinvite a speaker over political differences, decline to date, distance or drop contact in real life, or to defriend on social media. They're more likely to do all 5 of those things by their own self-report. And they tend to think that it's because they're virtuous. And with compassion, I try to look at everything with compassion and empathy. I believe that they're doing this because they've been consuming a lot of media that tells them that Trump is Hitler, Trump is a fascist. And you know what? Frankly, Dr. T, I don't think I would want to either have dinner with a Hitler supporter, right? Even though I share in my book that even people who are true KKK members or jihadi recruiters, the way that they change their minds is not by people cutting them off and telling them to shut up. It's by people dialoguing with them. Daryl Davis is an incredible example of that. He's an African-American musician who has a TED Talk where he displays the dozens of KKK hoods that were given to him by KKK members that he persuaded out of their ideology through dialogue. Nevertheless, though, I can certainly understand that not everybody wants to go sit down and dialogue, with Hitler and KKK people. But that, I think, is what's driving the people who are doing the 5Ds. They have watched enough mainstream media that they believe that their aunt or uncle or grandma or whatever who voted for Trump or who, believes that men are men and women are women, even if the man puts on a dress, they believe that that person is so hateful. It frankly reminds me of Tyler Robinson, who so ironically felt that Charlie Kirk was so hateful that Tyler had to go shoot and kill him because Charlie was so, quote, hateful, right? I mean, ironically, who's really the fascist? Who's really the hateful person, right, in that situation? So, to answer your question, how can we help them? It's hard to help people who don't want to be helped. We have to respect people's rights. On the other hand, I think that the first step is always understanding. So if you have a sense, like if people don't want to talk to you, we cannot force them to talk to us. But I do share some techniques in the book for inviting people to dialogue, so even just to say, I get that you think that I'm a fascist. Can you tell me more? What is your definition of a fascist? What specifically makes you think I'm a fascist? And instead of jumping in to debate them, just simply reflect back to them what they've said in a compassionate tone of voice that just says, I'm hearing you. I'm focusing on you. I'm trying to just simply understand what you're saying. And that can at least help to decrease some of the adversarial nature that can get so out of control in those dynamics.
Years ago, I think we started this in 2017 and we did it in 17, 18, and 19, and then, all the stuff with COVID started in 2020. But we taught a 6-week course called Mastering Vaccine Info. And it was a business partner of mine and I. He is a hypnotherapist and does a lot of behavioral types of things, but using hypnotherapy, and he just got a really long credential. But anyways, it was a 6-week course, and we alternated it every other week. I did a session on, what about polio, what about smallpox, and then he did a language a module. Then I did a session on what about safety and efficacy? What does that really mean? Then there was a ramp. One of the last section that I did was the ramp up of the schedule, and the ramp up of the pediatric schedule and the costs to society about vaccines. And in between times, he did these language things, and that what we taught a lot of the people, because people have a very hard time frequently communicating their feelings about vaccines, whether they're pro-vaccine or against vaccines, or suddenly the first grandbaby's coming along and the young people don't want to vaccinate their child, and the grandparents as maybe a doctor and a nurse, and they're saying, what do you mean? And then it just escalates from there. And so we taught them a lot about how to communicate, your position on why you didn't want to vaccinate, or why you thought they were wrong, or about all of the chemicals and adjuvants and aluminum and all the stuff that's in them, by asking questions instead of telling them and in their face. It was like, well, have you ever read a package insert? Or what do you really know about side effects of vaccines? Or if there is a side effect, what would you do about it? Particularly if it really, some kids die when they get vaccines. That's what the VAERS reports are all about. Are you familiar with VAERS? Do you know what that is? And asking those questions invites dialogue instead of making statements, and then somebody has to make a statement back. Is that
Totally.
part of?
Yeah, that's actually another technique in the book as well, is sometimes to just challenge yourself to see how many questions in a row you can ask. So part one of the book is the cognitive and emotional and social gifts of language. Part two is techniques, not only for speaking up, but also for listening when other people are saying things that you find vexing, right? And one of the techniques is called count the minutes, count the questions, and transfer the grace. And so what you do in that one is, first of all, you can just challenge yourself to see how many minutes you can listen. There's these phrases that I kind of came to the fore as I was writing about chomping at the bit. A lot of people, when it's hard for us to just literally keep our mouth shut when somebody's saying stuff, and we want to jump in with information, but we need to learn how to just relax our body. Even just doing some breathing exercises to relax your mouth and your jaw can be helpful. And then giving your brain something else to do a little bit to just count the minutes. And sometimes people are surprised. They're like, well, gee, I thought I'd been listening forever, but I'd only been listening for about 2 minutes, right? And then, to count the number of questions that you can ask in a row. And then to transfer the grace is where you try to imagine a time in your own life, a real experience, when you used to be on your high horse about some belief that you now, disagree with or think is a little cringy or whatever. And, you forgive yourself for that. And then you try to transfer that same grace to the person in front of you that is, maybe being really haughty or, a little on their high horse. And when we can just kind of remember that we've all been there a little bit and just focus on, as you said, asking questions and seeing how long we can listen, that often will really prime the pump. So once you've done that and then maybe reflected back to them what you heard them say and asked, did I get that correctly? Like, is that what you think? It can then be helpful if they say yes, to ask them, okay, would you be interested in hearing my perspective about it? Because if they say no, okay, fine. Like, you're not going to try to force the situation, and at least they're taking ownership that they don't want a dialogue, and then we have to respect that. But if they say yes, at least then they've also kind of mentally bought into this that yes, now I want to hear your perspective. And depending on the situation, you can say, sure, great, I'm happy to share it with you. I just have one little request, which is just like I recapped back to you what I heard you say, would you be willing to do that for me? Because when people's heart rates go above 100 beats per minute, they cognitively do not comprehend as well. That's why people get like they see red, they're talking past each other, things are escalating, and they're not even really hearing each other. So there's just as many almost techniques in the book for listening as for speaking up, because it's like the wings of a bird, right? We need two wings in order to fly, and we need listening and speaking to have a good dialogue.
That's so important because how many conversations have you had with people that you're not even really listening to what they're saying? You're just waiting for your next opportunity to lay out your next fact. And so that's really, really good. I want to go through the three parts of the title of your book. How can I say that? Which I think we've already talked about free speech. The second part, why free speech matters. And the third part, how to use it fearlessly. Why does free speech matter to your mental health? And just, sum that up for people.
Yeah, cognitive, emotional, and social. So if we're in a situation where we cannot speak our minds, we actually start suppressing and repressing our thoughts to the point where we can even almost come to dissociate from them, right? Like if you're in a situation where you don't feel like you're allowed to express when you're upset or angry, for example, you might just at the end of all day being in that situation, be stomping around the house and somebody says, "What's the matter?" And you say, "Nothing." And like, you mean it because you've pushed it so far into the back of your head that you're not even aware of it anymore. So, for people that are in a place like a university classroom where they're afraid that if they speak up, the professor's going to fail them. First of all, they might consider doing it anyway and maybe doing like if it's legal, a Project Veritas hidden camera, maybe go to the news, whatever. But if you're not up for that and you just want to sing the song and get your A, like I admit I did, it's really important for that cognitive awareness then to at least make sure after class you write down what you really think, or you talk to a friend and say what you really think, because that's one of the first things an abuser wants to do to a victim is get them isolated where they're not talking to people, because that's when we can really become vulnerable and start dissociating and be much more vulnerable to becoming brainwashed. And then the other gifts, as you said, is emotional. So again, we do our emotional regulation when we can talk about our thoughts and feelings and we can be in touch with them. We can start to really even examine our emotions and see if they make sense and not be overwhelmed by our emotions. This is partly why I was so shocked that no other psychologists besides maybe Jordan Peterson and one or two others were talking about the importance of free speech, because typically psychologists are all about, putting your feelings into words. It's like part of the whole point of therapy. But because my field politically identifies 90% plus as left, and right now, free speech is just randomly almost coded as a politically right issue, even though I think it's valuable and important to all of us. There's just no psychologist talking about it. But so emotional and then social. Like obviously, it's through those talks and sharing information and problem solving together and having support from one another that's how we have social bonds, which are so important to our mental health.
Wow, that's really important. And I didn't know that. I didn't know that most psychologists were kind of categorically left leaning. I didn't know that.
Yeah, and it's gotten worse. But yeah, I mean, these are statistics, I think, even just according to like the American Society of Social and Personality Psychologists or something. I mean, also the faculty ratio in most psychology departments, I share the stats in the book, but I believe it's something like 20 to 1 are liberal. And so, and not that there's anything wrong with being liberal. I think we need both. But when you have just this big echo chamber, then they're just not open to conservative ideas, and they don't have anybody representing those ideas because, those people become ostracized and marginalized.
That's a lot. So let's just, in the last few minutes that we have together here today, talk about the third part of your title, how to use it fearlessly. I think that that's really important. And particularly, how do, like the Z generation, how do they navigate so many hostilities that are up there now so that they continue to speak and just either don't go off the rail and just turn it into violence, or they just shut up and just shut down to everybody and everything. So how to use speech fearlessly.
Yeah, so I mean, there's so many ways. I'm proud to say I honest there's more than a dozen techniques on even just how to speak up. And then, like I mentioned, there's more as well on how to listen well. But for example, because you mentioned young people, which I think is really important, especially that they're in universities where there's this, big kind of ideology police almost that hangs over them, and there's this power dynamic about their grades. So one thing that can be helpful, incredibly helpful, is just to have an ally. So if you were to decide that you were going to speak up, in that college classroom or whatever, consider mentioning to a friend, I'm going to go ahead and speak up about this. Would you be willing to back me up? You don't have to say a lot, but even just simply saying, you know what? I kind of think the same thing sometimes, or maybe she's right. When the professor realizes that you're not completely alone, you're not such an easy target, right? It can also be helpful to take your university policy manual or, your corporate manual or whatever, upload it into ChatGPT and, say, hey, I'm thinking about speaking up and I'm really concerned about viewpoint discrimination at my university. What are some parts of this manual that, should help to give me comfort, right? And then you can go and meet with your professor and say, hey, I was thinking about speaking up to talk about X, Y, and Z. I wasn't sure. I kind of got the feeling maybe that viewpoint wasn't okay, but then I looked at the handbook and it says this and that. So you can start having a dialogue, and different professors are going to be open, to different types of things. But it can also be helpful to do what we call thought replacements. So to have a few thoughts in your mind that are going to be your go-to thoughts. If you make a plan that you want to speak up, you've thought it through. There's some techniques in the book too for thinking a situation through and deciding if, when, and how you want to speak up. But once you've decided, even if it's just in your friend group, on the group chat, when everybody's saying, let's go to the pro-abortion rally or whatever, and maybe you want to jump on and say, actually, I'm pro-life or whatever. Like even something like that can be really intimidating for people. So some thought replacements can even just be things like, I want to give people the chance to know the real me. I can't judge them for rejecting me before I even put myself out there. Or I could be breaking the ice and paving the way for other people to say their piece as well. I want to, I'm modeling and practicing my healthy conflict resolution skills, or, I owe it to others and to myself to tell the truth. So there's a lot of ways that you can do it. And one last, technique I'll just throw out there again, there's so many, but it can also be helpful to envision for some people as if you're on camera, right? So I did Dr. Phil's show, and one of the things that we talked about is that when the cameras are rolling, everybody's on their Sunday manners. Everybody suddenly, performs in this higher level because we have, this kind of social standards, right, around us. And so if you say to yourself, I'm just going to almost pretend like I'm an actor in a movie, and I've decided that I'm going to go ahead and say, well, hey, actually, I'm pro-life, right? And sometimes that can give people a little bit of to get out of their head a little bit, to kind of almost as if they're viewing the interaction on a screen, can ironically de-intensify it for some people.
Very good advice. All of that is really, really good advice. So, if we've got just a couple of minutes left in our time together here today, what's your most important take home message from the book, and where is the best place that they can buy it?
Yeah, the most important take-home message is that free speech is good for your mental health. And one other quick tip I meant to share is that it can be helpful if you're speaking up to have a debrief date planned. So to tell somebody, I'm going to do it, I'm going to have that thing where I'm going to speak up, and I want to talk to you. We have a cell phone catch-up call planned at 4 o'clock later that day. So if it goes well, you have support to celebrate. If it doesn't go well, you have support to figure it out, and it can layer in some accountability for you. So people can go anywhere books are sold. I'm so thankful for that. We didn't even get to talk about how hard it was to get this book published because the publishing industry leans way left, as I'm sure you know. But people can go to freespeechtoday.com. I made that forward to just a page about the book, so it's easy to remember, freespeechtoday.com. And there you can connect with me on social media. And I'm also doing some free groups just for people that want to talk about this subject because I'm really interested in it. And of course, the book is available anywhere books are sold. I'm very thankful for that. So freespeechtoday.com is the easiest way.
Everybody follow you on social media?
Yeah, I'm pretty active on X. So again, freespeechtoday.com is the easiest because it's a real handful to spell Dr. Chloe for people, but I'll do it. It's DRCHLOE_ on X. And I do get pretty active on there. I do other platforms too, Instagram and all that other stuff, but I find Twitter is kind of a fun place where people can get a little bit more spicy. But I do post interview clips and things like that everywhere on Instagram and Facebook and everywhere.
Very, very good. Well, this book that you wrote, Can I Say That? Why Free Speech Matters and How to Use It Fearlessly, should be on everybody's shelf because there's a lot of good tips and tricks and how-tos that can really be put into action. And I said that part of these interview processes is to motivate people into action. So with that, we're going to close out with one of my favorite verses of the Bible. I close all of my podcasts with, whether they are live or pre-recorded, which is Romans 12:12. Rejoice in hope, be patient in trouble, and be persistent in prayer. Remember to lean into God, trust Him for everything. He won't let you down. And I'll see you again tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern, right here on AmericaOutloud.news and iHeartRadio. The shows are then uploaded into your favorite podcast platform at Apple, Spotify, Pandora, TuneIn, and iTunes. iHeart Virtual Studio. That's a mouthful. You can find me at dr10penny.com and on my Substacks, dr10penny.substack.com and tenpennywalkwithgod.substack.com. So that's great. We're so grateful to have you here today, Dr. Chloe. We're so grateful for you stepping out and taking a big place in this because right now we need that, and it's so important for so many different people. It's really very good. So we'll see everybody. We're just so glad for you to be here. We're so glad for all of our audience.
Thank you.
And so have a great rest of your day, everybody. Goodbye and God bless.